Ukraine's drones have delivered one of the most crippling blows yet inside Russia. Nearly 38% of Moscow's oil refinery capacity has been knocked offline.
Russia is apparently running out of gas. Rationing is now in effect in some areas as Ukraine continues its drone attacks on its oil refineries.
It shows Western sanctions and Ukraine's strikes on critical facilities are making a dent.
Russia is experiencing something it hasn't seen in decades. A full-blown fuel crisis that's bringing one of the world's largest oil producers to its knees. We're talking about long queues at gas stations, rationing of 30 liters per person, and prices that have shot up 43% since January. Ukrainian drones have systematically dismantled nearly 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity, and the consequences are becoming unbearable for Russia. What makes this even more shocking is that Moscow, an oil giant, is now considering importing fuel just to keep its own people moving. So how did this all happen? And will these strikes force Russia to finally change its strategy? Or will they push Moscow into even more dangerous escalations? In this video, we will break down how Ukraine pulled this off, which refineries were hit, what Russia is doing to recover, and why this could be the most decisive turn in the war yet. While the world watches Russian tanks roll across battlefields and their missiles light up the Ukrainian sky, Ukraine has been quietly executing one of the most devastating economic warfare campaigns in modern history. As of October 3, 2025, 38% of Russia's primary oil refining capacity sits idle. That's 338,000 tons per day of processing power simply gone. To put that in perspective, Russia has lost more refining capacity in the past few months than it did during any previous crisis, including the peak of COVID-19 disruptions in 2020. The strategy didn't start recently. Ukraine launched its first wave of drone strikes against Russian refineries in January 2025, hitting targets systematically until mid-March. Then something interesting happened. Both sides agreed to a 30-day moratorium on striking energy infrastructure. That pause ended in late April, but Ukraine held back for 3 full months. Why? They were planning something bigger. When the second wave began in early August, it came with unprecedented precision and scale. Ukrainian forces weren't just launching random attacks anymore. They had identified the jugular veins of Russia's fuel production system and were cutting them one by one. The results speak for themselves. September's refinery downtime reached 338,000 tons per day, shattering the previous August record of 206,000 tons per day. Compare that to May 2022's 196,000 tons per day or May 2020's 164,000 tons per day, and you realize we're watching history unfold. Russians in Crimea and the Far East now face restrictions, no more than 30 liters of gasoline per customer. From Sakhalin in the east to Nizhny Novgorod in central Russia, over 20 regions are grappling with shortages. Small independent gas stations, which account for roughly 40% of Russia's fuel market, have started shutting down entirely because they can't secure supply. The irony cuts deep. Russia, a country that produces millions of barrels of oil daily, now has citizens waiting in Soviet-era style queues just to fill their tanks. The economic damage extends far beyond inconvenience. Gasoline production dropped by 1 million tons in September alone, creating a 20% deficit in the domestic market. Wholesale prices for AI-92 gasoline hit 72,500 rubles per ton by late August. That's roughly $895. Ukrainian drones have forced Moscow into an impossible position. According to data from Cyala, a market intelligence agency, approximately 70% of the current refinery downtime stems directly from drone attacks. These strikes have knocked out about a quarter of Russia's total refining capacity, roughly 236,000 tons per day. Every day those refineries stay offline, Russia loses 17,700 tons of gasoline and 35,100 tons of diesel that would normally flow to the domestic market. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. On September 1st, Russian officials convened emergency meetings with major oil companies, resulting in an extension of the gasoline export ban through the end of 2025. They also announced they'd manually regulate commodity exchange prices. If prices jump more than 10% in a month, they'd theoretically roll them back to the start-of-month levels. In practice, these measures have accomplished almost nothing. By October 1st, Russia was preparing something that would have been unthinkable just months ago: importing gasoline from China, South Korea, and Singapore. Yes, you heard that correctly. Russia, one of the world's largest oil producers, is now importing refined fuel. According to reports from Kommersant, a pro-government outlet, Moscow plans to lift import duties on fuel entering through select Far East checkpoints. The government will subsidize importers by covering the price difference between global market rates and Russia's artificially lower domestic prices using federal budget funds. Two entities have been authorized to handle these imports: Rosneft, the independent oil and gas company, and state-owned Pромsvязьimport. They're expected to bring in approximately 150,000 tons of gasoline monthly, shipping it from Asian suppliers to Siberian refineries, then distributing it across central Russia. Moscow is also boosting gasoline imports from Belarus, leveraging its allies' surplus refining capacity to plug holes in its own supply chain. Perhaps most disturbing is Russia's consideration of lifting the ban on monomethylaniline, an octane-boosting additive that's been illegal in Russia since 2016. Why was it banned? Because it's toxic and poses serious cancer risks. The fact that Moscow is even discussing reintroducing this chemical into fuel supplies shows just how desperate the situation has become. When you're weighing public health risks against fuel shortages, you've lost control of the situation. Despite all these interventions, Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak sent a written appeal to Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin warning that the risk of further deterioration in Russia's domestic fuel supply remains. This admission from such a high-level official confirms what everyone on the ground already knows: the measures aren't working. However, Moscow's propaganda machine has worked overtime to hide the truth from Russian citizens. State media attributes the crisis to seasonal demand increases and unscheduled maintenance. They carefully avoid mentioning Ukrainian drone strikes, but some Russian officials are breaking rank. Sergei Aksyonov, the Russian-installed head of occupied Crimea, admitted publicly that the market won't fully recover until the war against Ukraine is over, a rare acknowledgement that this is a war-related systemic crisis, not a temporary supply hiccup. But Ukraine's attack on Russia have not gone without response. Russia has ramped up its own attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure in direct retaliation, targeting gas networks and power stations across the country. This tit-for-tat energy warfare has created a dangerous escalation spiral where both sides are increasingly willing to hit civilian infrastructure to gain strategic advantage. The human cost has been severe. Russian infrastructure attacks during the first 5 months of 2025 resulted in 50% higher civilian casualties compared to the same period in 2024. April alone saw 1,389 casualties with 221 killed, while May recorded 1,019 casualties, including 183 deaths. These aren't just statistics, they represent real people whose lives were shattered because their apartment building happened to be near a power substation. Kharkiv has taken particularly heavy hits. More than a dozen Russian kamikaze drones struck energy facilities in the city, leaving 80,000 people in the Kholodnohursky district without electricity or homes. The attacks deliberately targeted transformers and distribution networks during evening hours to maximize disruption. Families found themselves without heating, refrigeration, or even lights as winter approached. The strategic calculus behind these strikes reveals an uncomfortable truth about who's really getting hurt. Sergei Vakulenko, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, told the Financial Times that Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries primarily impact civilians, not the military machine. Russian diesel exports have plummeted to their lowest levels since 2020, down 22.5% in August compared to January. While this hurts Russia's export revenues, it hasn't crippled the military's ability to operate. Russian armed forces maintain strategic fuel reserves and priority access to whatever diesel and gasoline the country still produces. The soldiers aren't the ones waiting in kilometer-long queues. Ordinary Russian citizens are. The Crimean situation illustrates the broader pattern. Sergei Aksyonov's admission that markets won't recover until the war against Ukraine is over represents one of the few times a Russian official has directly connected the fuel crisis to the conflict. His statement effectively confirms that Moscow views this as a sustained campaign that will continue as long as hostilities persist, and that is not about to end anytime soon, as the US is now getting directly involved in the Ukraine war.
The Trump administration is working to strong-arm Ukraine in the battlefield.
The United States will share intelligence with Ukraine for strikes on energy infrastructure within Russian territory.
For the first time, US agencies and the Pentagon will share targeting data, and this data will help Ukraine launch long-range missiles.
The Trump administration has greenlit US intelligence sharing specifically for Ukraine's long-range strikes on Russian energy infrastructure. American officials confirmed that intelligence support will now target refineries, pipelines, power stations, and other infrastructure far from its borders. This represents a massive escalation in direct US involvement beyond providing weapons. Washington is now helping Kyiv select and hit targets deep inside Russia. Even more significant, the US is weighing delivery of Tomahawk and Barracuda missiles to Ukraine, which would give Kyiv the capability to strike targets far deeper into Russian territory with far greater destructive power than current drone capabilities allow. If those weapons get delivered, we're talking about a fundamental shift in Ukraine's offensive capabilities. Tomahawk missiles have ranges exceeding 1,000 miles and can circle for hours just waiting for the perfect time to strike.
So in other words, once it's sent off, if you want to change where it's going,
Absolutely.
It loiters, it just goes in a circle and you figure out
where
it
It can be redirected and rerouted to a specific target.
Refineries wouldn't just be damaged, they'd be completely destroyed. And unlike drones, which can be shot down more easily and carry smaller payloads, Tomahawks are extremely difficult to intercept due to their low-altitude flight profile and sophisticated guidance systems. The volatility of this situation cannot be overstated. One major escalation, whether it's Russia striking a NATO supply line, Ukraine hitting a particularly sensitive target with these US missiles, or a miscalculation by any party, could shift everything overnight. Ukraine's strategy is currently clearly working from an economic warfare perspective. Russia is now importing gasoline for the first time in modern history, faces unprecedented domestic shortages, and has lost massive export revenues. But the danger of escalation grows with NATO's involvement. As NATO involvement deepens through intelligence sharing and potentially advanced weapons transfers, the risk of direct confrontation between nuclear powers is increasing each day. The coming months will be critical. And the question now isn't just whether Ukraine can maintain pressure, it's whether Russia will accept this new reality or respond with escalations that could spiral beyond anyone's control. So what's your take on Ukraine's drone strategy? Do you think these refinery strikes will force Russia to change course, or will this escalate into something far more dangerous? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this breakdown valuable, smash that like button and subscribe to stay ahead of the latest developments in this unfolding crisis. We'll keep tracking every strike, every retaliation, and every shift in this conflict. Until next time, stay informed.